What if the galaxy had a filing system and humans were placed in the bottom drawer? What if one quiet event on a forgotten station changed everything the universe believed about us? A demonstration, a diplomat, and a moment no one saw coming. This is not a story about power. It's about the moment power realized it might have underestimated the wrong species. The universe, as it turned out, had a filing system. Not the elegant, crystalline data matrices one might expect from advanced galactic civilizations, but something that would make a mid-tier corporate bureaucrat weep with recognition. Species were categorized, cross-referenced, and stamped with the kind of administrative finality that suggested someone somewhere was getting paid by the classification. At the top of this cosmic org chart sat the controllers and stabilizers. These beings were so adept at managing complex systems and maintaining order that they'd turn planetary governance into an art form, then into a science, and finally into a very profitable consulting business. The Zephyrins held this particular throne, resembling what might happen if someone gave velociraptors advanced degrees in xenobiotics and an unhealthy obsession with proper documentation. Below them, the architects and innovators occupied positions of strategic development, species that had mastered the art of creating new technologies and solutions while filling out patent applications. Then came the collaborators and specialists, the great majority of galactic civilization, who had somehow convinced themselves that contributing specialized skills efficiently was a form of civic duty. Finally, at the bottom lurked the utilizers and reclaimers, who had built entire cultures around the philosophy that someone else's leftovers were perfectly adequate. Thank you very much. This system had worked beautifully for approximately 12,000 years, which in galactic terms was long enough to become both traditional and bureaucratically entrenched. Species knew their place. Controllers knew their systems. And the Hegemony's Department of Interspecies Relations could process interspecies agreements with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled diplomacy machine. Then humans showed up and immediately began breaking things. Not intentionally, of course. Humans had arrived at galactic civilization the way most species did, confused, slightly overwhelmed, and filling out forms in triplicate. The Hegemony's xenobiologists had run their standard battery of tests, checked their charts, and arrived at what seemed like a reasonable conclusion: Adapter Plus. The plus designation had caused considerable debate in committee meetings. Humans used tools which bumped them above standard adapters. They had rudimentary space travel, which suggested a certain dangerous cleverness. They also had what the reports euphemistically termed pack coordination tendencies, which sounded much more manageable than whatever the field teams had actually witnessed. The Zephyrins, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that Adapter Plus was close enough to regular adapters for administrative purposes. After all, how much trouble could a species cause when their most impressive evolutionary adaptation appeared to be making sharp sticks? Station Omega-7 orbited a perfectly unremarkable star in a perfectly unremarkable system, which made it the perfect place for the Hegemony to conduct perfectly unremarkable business. The station served as a diplomatic outpost, trading hub and processing center for newly discovered species, a sort of cosmic DMV with better coffee and more tentacles. Commander Kaelen Rourke had been assigned to Station Omega-7 as humanities diplomatic attaché, a position that sounded impressive right up until one learned it came with quarters in the adapter wing and a daily schedule managed by aliens who spoke to him the way humans might address a particularly clever border collie. The adapter wing was exactly as luxurious as its name suggested. The quarters were smaller than standard, the doors required special authorization to unlock, and the cafeteria served what could generously be described as nutritionally adequate biomass. The architects had clearly subscribed to the design philosophy that adapter species didn't require dignity, just calories and basic life support. Kalen's daily routine had settled into a rhythm of professional humiliation. Morning briefings were held in Conference Room C, the C standing for creatures, as opposed to Conference Rooms A and B, which were reserved for actual people. During these sessions, Administrator Zixith, a mid-level Zephyrin bureaucrat with the personality of wet sandpaper, would explain the day's activities using the kind of slow, careful pronunciation typically reserved for children and the recently concussed. Today, Creature Rourke, Zixith would announce, each word delivered with the patience of someone explaining quantum physics to a houseplant. You will observe standard interspecies protocols. You will not speak unless addressed. You will not approach controller or architect species without escort. You will remember that your presence here is a privilege, not a right. The restrictions were comprehensive and creatively insulting. Kaelen couldn't access certain sections of the station without supervision. He couldn't initiate communications with other species. He couldn't even order his own meals. Apparently, adapter species couldn't be trusted to know what was good for them. What made it particularly galling was the casual nature of it all. The controller species didn't treat him poorly out of malice. They genuinely believed they were being kind. In their worldview, adapters existed to be managed, protected, and occasionally utilized for the greater good of galactic stability. Kalen's role was to nod, smile, and be grateful for their benevolent oversight. The breaking point came when Station Omega-7 received notice of an incoming delegation. Representatives from 3 major controller or architect species would be arriving for what the hegemony called interspecies harmony demonstrations. These events were designed to showcase the natural order of things and reinforce everyone's place in the cosmic hierarchy of adaptation and control. It's quite educational, Administrator Zixith explained during the briefing, his reptilian features arranged in what might have been meant as a reassuring expression. New adapter species observe established controller-adapter interactions. Very beneficial for understanding proper behavioral protocols. The demonstration would take place in Arena 7, a circular chamber with transparent walls that allowed observers to watch from safety. The process was straightforward. Representatives from each adapter or collaborator species would enter the arena, where controller/architect species would demonstrate their natural dominance through ritualized displays of their core abilities. Nothing fatal, of course. The hegemony wasn't barbaric, just enough controlled intimidation or display of superior function to establish the natural hierarchy. You'll be participating, naturally, Zixith continued. First time for humans, so quite the honor. The Kaelen specialists are particularly interested in your species' submission responses. Kaelen had maintained his diplomatic composure throughout 6 months of condescension, bureaucratic nonsense, and meals that violated several conventions on cruel and unusual punishment. But something about the phrase submission responses finally triggered the part of his brain that his academy instructors had spent 4 years trying to suppress. The demonstration day arrived with all the pomp and circumstance the hegemony could muster, which was considerable given their talent for turning bureaucracy into performance art. Arena 7 had been configured for optimal viewing, with comfortable seating for the controller's architect species and a small section of hard benches for adapter observers, because apparently even stadium seating reflected the natural order. The participating controllers and architects had arrived in force. 3 Zephyrins lounged in the premium seating, their razor-sharp talons clicking against their data pads as they made notes. A pair of Kaelen specialists dominated the center section, their insectoid forms radiating the kind of casual efficiency that came from millions of years of evolutionary optimization for focused tasks. 2 Vorthon innovators occupied the observation deck, their tentacled forms seeming to flow rather than sit, each movement suggesting barely contained ingenuity. The adapter collaborator section was notably less impressive. A handful of Deltarian adapters huddled together, their large eyes wide with nervous anticipation. 3 Proximan collaborators sat in stoic silence, their crystalline skin reflecting the arena lights in patterns that probably indicated extreme anxiety. And in the front row alone sat Commander Kaelen Rourke, reviewing his notes with the focused attention of someone studying for a particularly important exam. Administrator Zixith activated the arena's communication system, his voice echoing through the chamber with practiced authority. Today's demonstration will showcase proper interspecies behavioral protocols. Adapter collaborator species will enter the arena individually for interaction with our controller/architect volunteers. Remember, this is an educational experience designed to promote galactic harmony through natural hierarchy recognition. The first adapter representative, a Deltarian named something unpronounceable, entered the arena with the resigned grace of someone attending their own funeral. The Kaelen specialist that approached moved with fluid precision, its compound eyes analyzing the herbivore with professional interest. The interaction lasted exactly 90 seconds, a brief display of specialized movement, a submissive posture from the Deltarian, and polite applause from the audience. The second demonstration proceeded similarly. The Proximan representative entered, encountered a Vorthin innovator, and performed what appeared to be their species' equivalent of rolling over and playing dead. More polite applause. Then Administrator Zixith announced, representing the human species, Creature Rourke. Kaelen stood, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the arena entrance with the measured pace of someone heading to a business meeting. The controller architects section rustled with interest. Humans were still something of a novelty, and their adaptation responses remained undocumented in the official literature. The Kaelen specialists have volunteered to conduct this demonstration, Zixith continued. Specialist Vexi, please proceed with standard ability establishment protocols. Specialist Vexi rose from the Collaborators section and descended into the arena with the liquid grace that had made Kaelians the galaxy's most successful mid-tier specialists. Standing nearly 7 feet tall on 4 articulated legs, with arms that ended in razor-sharp claws and a head that resembled something from humanity's worst nightmares, Vexi was evolution's answer to the question, what if we made spiders bigger and gave them specialized tools? The specialist circled Kaelen slowly, analyzing his posture, breathing, and stress responses with the methodical precision of a professional. Standard protocol called for a dominance maneuver, a controlled application of pressure to the adapter's shoulder or neck, just enough to demonstrate superior strength without causing permanent damage. Vexi moved in with practiced efficiency. The maneuver, when it came, was perfectly executed, a display of strength that should have sent any reasonable adapter species into immediate submission. Instead, Kaelen tilted his head slightly. Interesting technique, he said conversationally, his voice steady. Good jaw pressure, nice even distribution of force. Though you might want to adjust your angle of approach. You're telegraphing the move about 2 seconds early. The arena fell completely silent. Specialist Vexi, who had successfully dominated approximately 400 adapter species over a distinguished career, found himself in the unprecedented position of receiving constructive feedback from his target. The specialist maintained his grip, waiting for the delayed submission response that surely had to be coming. Also, Kaelen continued, his voice carrying the same tone he might use to discuss the weather, your grip positioning leaves your third joint exposed. See, if I just apply pressure here, what happened next would be debated in xenobiotics journals for the next 50 years. Kaelen's hand moved with casual precision, finding a pressure point that Kaelen anatomy texts insisted didn't exist. Specialist Vexi, the collaborator extraordinaire, suddenly found his dominant limb completely numb and unresponsive. You'll lose motor control, Kaelen finished. It's temporary, don't worry. Circulation should return in about 3 minutes. The specialist staggered backward, his compound eyes wide, with what could only be described as existential confusion. In 4 decades of interspecies interactions, no one had ever critiqued his technique, much less demonstrated superior knowledge of Kaelen anatomy. This is highly irregular, Administrator Zixith announced, though he seemed uncertain whether he was addressing Kaelen or the universe in general. We're just getting started, Kaelen replied cheerfully. See, I think there's been a bit of a misunderstanding about human evolutionary history. We weren't actually just adapter animals. We were persistence hunters. He turned to address the observation deck, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone delivering a well-rehearsed presentation. Persistence hunting, for those not familiar with the concept, involves chasing animals until they die of exhaustion. Not particularly sophisticated, but remarkably effective. Humans could run down virtually any land animal on our home planet. We just keep coming, hour after hour, until our target literally collapsed from fatigue. The Zephyrins in the premium seating exchanged glances that, in their species, indicated severe conceptual distress. Of course, we also developed pack hunting strategies, Kaelen continued, warming to his topic. Coordinated group tactics, complex communication, strategic planning. We'd study our targets' behavior patterns, predict their movements, and execute multi-stage ambushes that could span days or even weeks. Specialist Vexi, still nursing his paralyzed limb, made a sound that might have been a whimper. But the really interesting part, Kaelen said, his smile taking on a quality that made several observers suddenly remember urgent appointments elsewhere, is what we did for fun. He gestured toward the arena's equipment storage. Mind if I demonstrate some human recreational activities? I promise it'll be educational. Administrator Zixith, operating on autopilot and the kind of bureaucratic momentum that had carried him through decades of standard procedures, nodded weakly. Kaelen retrieved a length of rope from the equipment storage, the kind used for emergency repairs around the station. With movements that were almost too quick to follow, he fashioned what appeared to be a simple slip knot. This is called a lasso, he explained. We invented it for capturing livestock, but it became a competitive sport. Humans would practice roping moving targets for entertainment. The current record for accuracy is held by someone who could lasso a running target from horseback at distances exceeding 50 meters. He demonstrated with a casual flick of his wrist. The rope sailed across the arena and settled neatly around a support pillar with mathematical precision. Of course, that's nothing compared to what we developed for unarmed combat, Kaelen continued. Humans created martial arts. Entire philosophical systems built around the concept of fighting without weapons. We have hundreds of different styles, each designed to exploit the weaknesses of specific opponents. The Vorthan innovators in the observation deck began exhibiting the flowing motions that in their species indicated extreme agitation. Would anyone like to volunteer for a demonstration? Kaelen asked brightly. It's perfectly safe. Well, mostly safe. I mean, accidents happen, but that's part of the learning experience. The silence that followed was profound enough to qualify as an existential statement. No volunteers? That's fine. I can demonstrate some techniques solo. Kaelen moved into what the observers would later describe as a series of precise, controlled movements that somehow managed to look both graceful and terrifying. This is called Krav Maga, a hand-to-hand combat system designed for efficiency and brutal effectiveness against any threat. What the alien observers were witnessing was actually a relatively basic form from Kaelen's academy training, but to species that had never conceived of violence as an art form, it looked like watching someone casually juggle live grenades. The beauty of human martial arts, Kaelen explained as he moved through the sequence, is that they're based on principles rather than specific anatomy. We can adapt our techniques to work against virtually any opponent, regardless of size, strength, or species characteristics. He paused in a stance that left him looking deceptively relaxed while actually being positioned to respond to attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. For instance, Specialist Vexi's species relies heavily on their superior reach and claw weapons. But longer limbs mean more joints to manipulate, and claws are useless if you can't position them properly. He smiled with the kind of professional warmth that made hardened diplomats reach for their panic buttons. The specialist in question had backed himself against the arena wall, his compound eyes tracking Kaelen's movements with the focused attention of someone watching their own execution. Now, I should mention that humans also developed weapons, Kaelen continued conversationally. We started with sharpened sticks, which your researchers noted. But we didn't stop there. We invented bows, crossbows, firearms, explosives, chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons, and several categories of armament that are still classified. The Zephyrins were no longer taking notes. They were staring at Kaelen with the kind of horrified fascination typically reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. But here's the thing that I think your classification system missed, Kaelen said, his tone shifting to something that resembled gentle instruction. Humans didn't develop these capabilities because we were just architects of destruction. We developed them because we were adapters who got tired of being consumed or controlled. The observation deck had grown so quiet that the station's life support systems sounded like thunder. See, Earth was full of things that wanted to kill, such big cats, bears, wolves, venomous snakes, disease-carrying insects, poisonous plants, and weather patterns that could freeze or cook us without warning. We weren't at the top of any food chain. We were barely clinging to the middle. So we learned to adapt. Kaelen's expression grew thoughtful, almost philosophical. The funny thing about being an adapter is that it teaches you to think differently than controllers do. Controllers focus on their systems, their strength, their order, their established hierarchies. But adapters have to focus on everything else. We learn to notice patterns, predict behavior, exploit weaknesses, and most importantly, work together. He gestured toward the observation deck, where the assembled controller/architect species were now displaying what could generously be called acute situational awareness. A single human isn't particularly dangerous, Kaelen continued. We're not the strongest, fastest, or most well-armed species in the galaxy, but we're excellent at learning, adapting, and coordinating our efforts. We also have what you might call an unusual relationship with conflict. The statement hung in the air like a threat wrapped in academic terminology. Most controller species engage in conflict to establish dominance, defend territory, or acquire resources, Kaelen explained. Humans engage in conflict for those reasons too, but we also fight for abstract concepts like justice, freedom, and revenge. We'll wage war over philosophical differences. We fought battles that lasted generations over principles that existed only in our minds. Administrator Zixith's claws were clicking against his datapad with increasing frequency, producing a sound like nervous castanets. More importantly, Kaelen said, we've learned to place limits on our conflict. Rules of engagement, laws of war, codes of conduct. We developed these not because we were naturally peaceful, but because we were so naturally capable of intense conflict that we needed formal systems to prevent ourselves from destroying everything we cared about. He paused, allowing this information to settle into the minds of his audience like sediment in still water. So when you classified humans as Adapter Plus, you were making the same mistake that controllers have made about us for roughly 200,000 years. You assume that because we could be subdued, we were designed to be managed. But the truth is, we are persistence adapters who learn to think like collaborators, which made us very, very good at controlling our environment and, if necessary, those who seek to control us. The arena's silence was broken by the soft sound of Administrator Zixith activating his emergency communication device. Hegemonic control. This is Station Omega-7, he said, his voice carrying the carefully controlled panic of someone trying to report a disaster while maintaining professional composure. We need immediate consultation with the Department of Species Reclassification. Priority Alpha. Possibly Priority Alpha Alpha. Actually, just connect me to whoever handles existential threats to the established order. Kaelen nodded approvingly. That's probably wise. You'll want to update your files. The response from Hegemony Control crackled through the arena's speakers. Acknowledge Station Omega-7. Reclassification team is en route. Estimated arrival in 6 hours. Current threat assessment? Administrator Zixith looked at Kaelen, who was calmly coiling up the rope he'd been using for his demonstration. Unknown, he replied. Potentially significant. Advise all personnel to avoid sudden movements and maintain respectful distance. Understood. Implementing Protocol 7, diplomatic incident with possible foundational implications. The weeks that followed would later be remembered as the Great Reclassification Crisis of Station Omega-7. Emergency xenobiologists arrived in force, armed with instruments that could analyze everything from bone density to psychological profiles. They ran tests, conducted interviews, and compiled reports with the desperate efficiency of people trying to prevent a galactic incident. The results were both comprehensive and deeply disturbing to the established order. Humans, it turned out, possess physical capabilities that place them in the upper tier of collaborators. Their psychological profiles indicated strategic thinking that rivaled the controllers. Their technological development suggested a species that treated innovation as both science and art. Most troubling of all, their social structures indicated a species that had learned to cooperate on scales that made other architects' collaborative behaviors look like casual acquaintanceships. The Reclassification Committee spent 3 days in closed session, emerging with the kind of haunted expressions typically associated with tax accountants and military chaplains. Their final report contains 17 different proposed classifications, ranging from Collaborator Plus to Controller Provisional to something called Category Undefined, Recommend Careful Monitoring. In the end, they settled on a designation that had never been used before, Apex Cooperative Controller. The classification came with a footnote longer than most species' entire files, essentially explaining that humans were to be treated as equals by default and approached with the same caution one might use when dealing with unexploded ordnance. The practical effects were immediate and sweeping. Kaelen's quarters were relocated to the diplomatic wing, actual diplomatic quarters with proper security clearance and access to the good cafeteria. His daily briefings were moved to Conference Room A, where he was addressed as Ambassador Rourke and consulted on matters of station policy. More significantly, the other controller architect species began treating him with a kind of wary respect typically reserved for natural disasters and hostile takeovers. Conversations became more polite, requests became suggestions, and orders became invitations for collaboration. The Kaelen specialists were particularly affected by the revelation. Specialist Vexi, once he recovered from his temporary paralysis, approached Kaelen with what might have been an apology and definitely was a request for martial arts instruction. The concept of learning to adapt and apply specialized skills better appealed to the specialist mindset, even if the source of that knowledge challenged their fundamental assumptions about the universe. The Zephyrins adapted with the flexibility that had made them successful bureaucrats. If humans were apex cooperative controllers, then clearly the appropriate response was to update the forms, revise the procedures, and file the paperwork in triplicate. They were particularly intrigued by human concepts of diplomatic immunity and mutually assured destruction, which seemed to offer new approaches to conflict resolution. The Vorthan innovators, being somewhat more philosophical by nature, spent considerable time discussing the implications of a species that had evolved cooperation as a survival strategy rather than a convenience. They were especially fascinated by human concepts of justice and proportional response, which suggested a species that had learned to moderate its capabilities through social pressure rather than biological limitation. 6 months later, Station Omega-7 had settled into what could generously be described as a new normal. The HFY's bureaucrats had managed to adapt their classification system to accommodate the reality of human capabilities, though the paperwork was still being processed through 17 different departments. Ambassador Kaelen Rourke, his official title now, served as the station's first interspecies harmonization coordinator, a position that had been created specifically to handle situations where traditional hierarchical relationships broke down. His office was located in the diplomatic wing's prime real estate, with a view of the station's central hub and access to communication arrays that could reach anywhere in the galaxy. The job description was deliberately vague, which suited Kaelen perfectly. His primary responsibility appeared to be maintaining productive relationships between species with potentially incompatible worldviews, which in practice meant preventing the galaxy's various controller/architect species from accidentally provoking humanity into demonstrating why cooperation was preferable to conflict. It was delicate work, requiring a blend of diplomacy, psychology, and what the HFY's personnel manual euphemistically termed system equilibrium communication. Kaelen had discovered that most interspecies conflicts could be resolved by helping each party understand exactly what the other party was capable of, then suggesting collaborative alternatives that avoided anyone having to find out definitively. The morning briefings had evolved into something resembling actual diplomatic sessions. Representatives from various species would present their concerns, negotiate resource allocations, and coordinate responses to developing situations across the sector. The discussions were remarkably civil, possibly because everyone involved had developed a healthy appreciation for the consequences of being unreasonable. Ambassador Administrator Zixith said during one such briefing, "We've received a request from the HFY Council. They're interested in human perspectives on conflict resolution protocols." Kaelen looked up from his coffee, real coffee, imported from Earth at considerable expense, and smiled, the kind of smile that had become his diplomatic trademark. It was warm, professional, and somehow managed to convey both friendliness and the subtle suggestion that disappointing him would be inadvisable. "Of course," he replied. "I'd be happy to share some insights about human approaches to dispute resolution." The other species representatives leaned forward with interest. Over the past months, they'd learned that human perspectives on traditionally controller concerns were both useful and occasionally terrifying. "The key principle," Kaelen began, "is what we call escalation management. The idea is to resolve conflicts at the lowest possible level of intensity while maintaining the capability to escalate if necessary." He activated the briefing room's holographic display, showing a simple pyramid diagram. At the base, we have negotiation, voluntary cooperation based on mutual benefit. Above that, mediation, third-party assistance in finding common ground. Then arbitration, accepting binding decisions from neutral authorities. And the diagram showed additional levels rising toward the apex of the pyramid, each labeled with increasingly formal terms. The higher levels involve economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and what we call demonstration of capabilities, Kaelen continued. The goal is to help all parties understand the full range of possible outcomes so they can make informed decisions about which level of engagement they prefer. Specialist Vexi, who had become something of a regular attendee at these briefings, raised one of his razor-sharp appendages. Ambassador, what happens if negotiation through demonstration of capabilities fails to resolve the conflict? Kalen's smile widened slightly, taken on the quality that had made hardened warriors across 3 sectors suddenly remember urgent appointments with their therapists. That's when we reach the apex of the pyramid, he said cheerfully. We call it conflict resolution through applied physics. It's very effective, though the paperwork afterward can be quite extensive. The briefing room fell into the kind of contemplative silence that typically followed profound revelations about the nature of existence. However, Kaelen continued, I'm pleased to report that we've never actually had to implement apex-level protocols. It turns out that most conflicts can be resolved through clear communication and creative problem-solving, especially when all parties understand the alternatives. Administrator Zixith's claws clicked against his data pad in what had become his signature expression of thoughtful consideration. The Hegemony Council will be very interested in these concepts. They've been dealing with several territorial disputes that have proven resistant to traditional controller dominance resolution. I'd be happy to consult on those situations, Kaelen offered. Human experience suggests that territorial conflicts often stem from resource scarcity or communication failures rather than genuine incompatibility. With proper analysis and creative alternatives, most disputes can be transformed into collaborative opportunities. The Vorthon Innovator representative made the flowing gesture that indicated philosophical approval. This approach suggests that conflict resolution is itself a form of cooperation, working together to avoid working against each other. Exactly, Kaelen agreed. The most effective controllers aren't those who dominate through force, but those who create systems where cooperation becomes more profitable than conflict. It's evolution in action. Species that learn to work together survive longer and prosper more than those who rely purely on individual capabilities. He paused, allowing his words to settle into the minds of his audience like seeds finding fertile ground. After all, he continued, with the kind of casual observation that would later be quoted in diplomatic textbooks, the most successful controllers in human history weren't those who conquered everything in sight. They were the ones who learned when not to fight, how to build alliances, and why sometimes the best victory is the one where everybody walks away alive and willing to do business again. The briefing concluded with the usual exchange of formal courtesies, but as the various species representatives filed out of the room, their conversations carried the tone of beings who had glimpsed new possibilities for organizing their universe. Later that evening, Kaelen stood in his office looking out at the starfield beyond Station Omega-7's transparent aluminum viewports. The galaxy stretched before him in all its chaotic glory. Billions of species, countless conflicts, and infinite opportunities for both cooperation and disaster. His communication console chimed softly, indicating an incoming message from Earth. The text was brief and characteristically direct. Heard about your promotion. Try not to start any wars. Admiral Marcus Kaelen smiled and composed his reply. No promises. The galaxy's more interesting than we thought. KR. He sent the message and returned to his contemplation of the stars. Somewhere out there, other species were probably discovering that their neat classifications didn't quite capture the full complexity of the universe. Controllers were learning that cooperation could be more effective than domination. Adapters were realizing that survival sometimes required developing new capabilities. And humans, as usual, were adapting to circumstances by helping everyone else adapt as well. The universe still had its filing system, but the categories were becoming more fluid. Controller and stabilizer, architect and innovator, collaborator and specialist, adapter and resilient, utilizer and reclaimer. These were starting to look less like permanent classifications and more like starting points for negotiation. After all, the most effective controller wasn't necessarily the one with the sharpest claws or the strongest grip. Sometimes it was the one who convinced everyone else that they were all on the same side working toward common goals, until cooperation became so natural that no one remembered why they used to clash in the first place. Kaelen finished his coffee and began reviewing the next day's briefing materials. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for creative diplomacy, and probably at least one species that needed gentle instruction in the benefits of collaborative problem solving. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, he could simply appreciate the irony of a universe where the adaptable had taught the controllers how to be civilized, and everyone was still trying to figure out whether that was evolution or just really good marketing. They came expecting submission. What they got was a lesson in evolution. Not the kind written in DNA, but the kind written in history, by species that refuse to stay in their place. Sometimes the most dangerous beings are the ones who don't look dangerous at all. If this story made you think twice about our place in the galaxy, like the video, subscribe, and share it with fellow sci-fi lovers. And tell me in the comments, if humanity entered the galactic stage today, how should we be classified?